There are plenty of crime games where you're asked to save this city, stop the bad guys, or become the hero everyone depends on. Then there are games that throw all of those ideas away and instead ask a much more uncomfortable question. What happens when the people you're controlling are every bit as dangerous as the criminals chasing them? What happens when loyalty barely exists, trust disappears after every single job, and survival becomes the only thing either one of those characters still cares about? That uncomfortable feeling is exactly what made Kane Lynch different from almost every other third-person shooter released during its era. And it also explains why, despite never becoming a blockbuster, players continue talking about it more than like 15 years later. The series first began in 2007 with Kane Lynch Dead Man, developed by IO Interactive, same publishers of Hitman games, and instead of creating another stylish assassin fantasy, well, these developers introduced Adam, which was actually named Kane, Adam Marcus, which was a former mercenary sentenced to death after a failed mission, alongside another character called James Seth Lynch, which was a psychologically unstable criminal who's violent, unpredictably, constantly threatened everyone around them. Their partnership was never built on friendship or respect, it was basically built on necessity. The two men were forced together while trying to survive impossible situations involving organized crime, betrayals, corrupt mercenaries, and law enforcement agencies attempting to hunt them down. 3 years later, Kane Lynch 2 Dog Days pushed the series into even darker territory by moving the action to Shanghai and presenting like the entire experience through a disturbing handheld camera style that made players feel like they were basically watching leaked footage rather than playing a traditional video game. The series right there divided a bunch of critics, but over time it quietly developed a loyal audience that appreciated just how different it was from everything else on the market. That sort of leads to a question fans continue asking today. What if Kane Lynch finally returned? Well, there's currently no official sequel or remake in development. IO Interactive no longer owns the franchise even after becoming independent in 2017, which makes a return more complicated now, but the demand from longtime fans have never completely disappeared. Discussions about a sequel, a reboot, or remake continue across gaming communities even though no publishers ever officially announced one. Perhaps that's because very few games ever captured crime the way Kane Lynch did. Not glamorous, not heroic, not exciting in the traditional Hollywood sense, just desperate. Imagine a modern reboot refusing to begin with explosions, music, cinematic music, or dramatic speeches or whatever. Instead, the camera opens inside a cheap motel somewhere on the edge of like a forgotten industrial district. Morning sunlight then barely squeezes through stained curtains while this old television quietly plays local news about another violent robbery that happened overnight. These two aging criminals silently prepare for another job because neither one has figured out how to live any other way. Nobody explains who they are, nobody delivers an emotional monologue. The audience simply watches two exhausted men getting ready for another terrible decision. That kind of opening immediately establishes something modern crime games often forget. Real criminals rarely feel larger than life. Most are simply trapped inside lives they no longer know how to escape. A new Kane Lynch should lean completely into that idea. Or rather than trying to become another action game, it should embrace the slower, unforgettable atmosphere that made Dog Days so memorable. Every mission should feel unpredictable because plans constantly fall apart. The world itself deserves just as much attention as the characters. Like imagine huge modern cities that feel completely indifferent to everything happening inside them. The game shouldn't encourage players to admire these environments though. It should encourage them to believe them. Combat also deserves a completely different philosophy than most shooting games. Kane Lynch has never really been about becoming an unstoppable killing machine. Nobody behaves like a perfectly trained soldier in this game, they're simply trying to stay alive. That unpredictability creates tension far more effectively than overwhelming firepower ever could. The relationship between Kane Lynch should remain the emotional center because the personalities have always carried the series. Kane represents cold calculation, Lynch exists as the complete opposite. Sometimes they argue, sometimes they laugh, sometimes entire minutes pass without either one of them saying a single word. That silence becomes just as important as a dialogue, I would say. Community discussions surrounding the franchises remain surprisingly active, in fact, despite its long absence. Many players continue praising the series for its unusual atmosphere, the morally complicated protagonists, grounded crime storytelling, and the especially raw visual presentation of Dog Days, while other ones argue that the franchise deserves another chance with stronger mechanics and more polished gameplay. Requests for remasters, reboots, and sequels still appear regularly throughout dedicated fan communities, even though most acknowledge the complicated ownership situation surrounding the property. Perhaps that's exactly why Kane Lynch still feels relevant. Not because it was perfect, because almost nobody has attempted to replace it. Modern crime games often become larger, louder, more cinematic every year, but very few are willing to embrace the uncomfortable realism that made this series memorable. There are no superheroes hiding beneath suits. There are no criminal masterminds that are delivering theatrical speeches or whatever. There are only flawed people making desperate decisions while convincing themselves they'll somehow fix everything after one final job. That honestly remains surprisingly rare. If the franchise ever returns, whether through a complete remake or an entirely new sequel, the developers shouldn't chase blockbuster spectacle simply because modern hardware allows it. They should instead preserve the uncomfortable identity that separated Kane Lynch from every other shooter of his generation while refining the gameplay, the world, the gameplay, and allowing these two unforgettable anti-heroes to exist inside a crime story that feels even more believable than before. Because sometimes the games worth bringing back aren't the ones that were universally loved, they're the ones that tried something nobody else was brave enough to even attempt. There's currently no official sequel or remake in development. IO Interactive no longer owns the franchise even after becoming independent in 2017, which makes a return more complicated now, but the demand from longtime fans have never completely disappeared. Discussions about a sequel, a reboot, or remake continue across gaming communities even though no publishers ever officially announced one. Perhaps that's because very few games ever captured crime the way Kane Lynch did. Not glamorous, not heroic, not exciting in the traditional Hollywood sense, just desperate. Kane Lynch has always belonged in that category, and after all these years, it still feels like one more job's waiting for Kane Lynch somewhere out there, even if neither one of them believes they're gonna make it home. Which they might actually not this time.